Joining us now on the Picks Four Polls podcast, we're continuing our summer scouting off-season series, focusing in on the Michigan Wolverines. This time we've got Alejandro Zuniga in the house. He covers Michigan football for the Michigan Insider as part of 247 Sports. Check him out on Twitter at @byazuniga. How's it going? Thanks for hopping on here.
Hey, it's great. It's always a good day when you can talk some football in the dog days of summer.
Exactly. It is, really interesting with what's going on at Michigan. Because if you look at all these Big Ten teams, there's, to me, in my opinion, at least, no team that's undergone as many changes as the reigning national champions have. You send 13 to 14 guys to the NFL. You have, obviously, the Big Ten expansion going on. But then also you have a first-year head coach in Sharon Moore taking over for Harbaugh, who, again, was there for a lot of years. But, just take us inside. What's the vibe in Ann Arbor with all these changes that are kind of taking place, but also a lot of good things happening too?
Yeah, I think it's very much a tenuous situation, right? Which is Michigan just won a national championship. It's kind of the culmination of several years of success, right? 2023 was the end of a 3-year run where Michigan won 3 straight Big Ten championships. But last year was their window. And so many players, your Roman Wilsons, your Blake Corums, your Zach Zinners, your Trevor Keegans, who are now in the NFL, they all came back last year to win a national championship. They succeeded at that goal. But now, the football world doesn't stop. And everything's turning over a new leaf. There is so much uncertainty on the offensive side of the ball. There is uncertainty on the coaching perspective, right? The entire defensive staff was recreated over this offseason. And it's a first-year head coach in Sharon Moore, who's never been a college head coach before, who has risen up through the ranks very quickly at Michigan, and who, he had his trial by fire last year, right? He was an interim coach last year. But there's just a lot of uncertainty. And I think a lot of gratitude that Michigan did win a national championship, that they accomplished their goal when their window of opportunity was open. But now will Michigan be able to sustain that, become a long-term dominant force in a new look Big Ten, or does it go back to rebuilding for a few years? What's that going to look like? And, this is the first year we'll start to find that out.
Yeah. And talking about sustaining that, success, kind of looking ahead to this year and specifically looking ahead to next year's draft, Wolverines, they said, we had talked about it, a lot of players to this past year's draft, over 13 players, a lot of core pieces like you covered who were big parts of that team. But, Michigan wouldn't be a national championship level team if they didn't have, other pieces and other players in depth to kind of, fill in for those guys and, make up for that and things of that nature. So the pipeline still figures to be strong. Who are some of the top names that are on this roster going into next year that are going to be draft eligible that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, I think if you want to start talking about 2025 NFL draft with Michigan, I think the way I look at it is next year's draft. So this year's draft in 24, right? Michigan had 13 players drafted. It was a program record. It was the most by any school this year. They had 18 players invited to the combine, which that was a record as well. Next year, I'd say fewer players drafted, but more star power, more players drafted in that first couple rounds. And it starts on the defensive side of the ball. So I'm going to give you 3 names right off the bat. It's 2 of the best defensive tackles in college football, Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. They are both rising juniors. They are roommates. They are 2 players that Jim Harbaugh once called God's gift to football because of their body makeup and their desire to be good at football. And then a cornerback in Will Johnson, who's been a star since his freshman year. He's a guy who, he was a 5-star prospect. He is a legacy kid. He was a freshman All-American for PFF back a couple of years ago. And he was kind of the star of the show last year in matchups against Marvin Harrison Jr., against Rome Odunze, against Ohio State and Washington, respectively. Those are 3 guys who, when you're looking at your draft board for 25, you're probably thinking first round. And for a guy like Will Johnson and maybe Mason Graham, you're thinking top 10, top 15, depending on how this season plays out. So that's where I'd start when you're looking at Michigan in the NFL draft next year.
Yeah, because, we were doing some early research, and I mean, Andrew and I both got super excited over Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, which I feel like is going to be a bit of a tongue twister because you have Graham and Grant to kind of get used to. But how are both of those guys similar? How are both of those guys different? And then more importantly, who are they as people and not necessarily football players? Because there's a lot of, I think, interactions that take place, and when you're at these games and these practices and you're watching these guys from the sidelines, you certainly see this human element come out.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, both of them, I think I'd call them pretty similar, honestly, in terms of people. Just again, like I mentioned, they're housemates, the roommates. They are very, very tight. They're friends. Fun people to get to know. Mason Graham, he's coming out of California. You'll remember, I mean, as with anyone of about this age, like they were coming up as high school prospects when there was a pandemic going on. And in California, for a guy like Mason Graham, I don't remember the specifics, but I think they like played a 7-on-7 season, or they played in the spring instead of the fall. But like it really impacted maybe the way that college programs were able to scout them, maybe the way that they were able to showcase their development. But he's a guy, Mason, who's got a background as a wrestler. He's a former wrestler, and he played both ways in high school. He would play offensive line and defensive line. He would play every snap in a football game, and that put him on Michigan's radar. And quite honestly, like he was a late riser in the recruiting rankings, maybe in part because of, the extenuating circumstances that were going on in the world. But Michigan really found a hidden gem when they pulled him. And similar story for Kenneth Grant. I mean, I'd say he's more of a raw prospect at this point. He's the guy who you were talking earlier about how important it was for Michigan to have depth on a national championship run. He was one of those pieces, really, where I don't think he really technically started many, if any, games last year, but Michigan rotated so much on the defensive line that he played starter snaps. It'll be interesting to see this year if he has the stamina to play, 60 plus snaps a game on the defensive side of the ball, because it's not something he's had to do. It's not something Michigan wanted him to do last year, but he's at the talent, like he's got the talent level where you want to keep him on the field as much as possible.
Yeah, that was the interesting thing about Grant is, kind of him transitioning to that full-time role, or more of a full-time role, I should say. He's still getting a ton of snaps for the collegiate level. So I think with those two, it's going to be interesting to see their kind of dynamic and how they play off each other throughout the course of the season, because they both have very different kind of skill sets, just off of my initial watches of both of them from last year. Now, kind of finishing off on that defensive trio that you mentioned, go in depth a little bit more on Will Johnson. What are some of the things that make him such a great cornerback prospect? And, there's a lot of conversation about who's going to be the top cornerback in next year's draft. Obviously, you have Travis Hunter from Colorado, who's going to be in that conversation as well. What does Will Johnson bring to the table that's unique and makes him, that's a highly sought after cornerback prospect?
I think I would just say consistency. Honestly, it's consistency, and he's proven it for 2+ years at this point. I mean, he's, like I mentioned before, he was a 5-star prospect. I'd say when you're looking at players that you look at them in high school and you can project them to the NFL, I think cornerback and like the secondary is the positions where that's easiest, because that seems to translate easily, or more easily, I guess, or more smoothly to the college level and then on to the NFL. And Will Johnson, he's a guy who, again, he came in as a 5-star. He maybe struggled a little bit in mop-up duty very, very early on as a freshman. But then the back half of this freshman season, he really took over. He had a couple interceptions in the Big Ten championship game against Purdue, had his first interception in a tight game at Rutgers. And so, you could tell, he was on an upward trajectory. And it was, what's that going to look like in 2023 when he's the star guy on the defense? And it was everything you wanted, right? You look back at some of the biggest matchups of the year. Like I mentioned, he was one-on-one with Rome Odunze. He was one-on-one with Marvin Harrison Jr., two of the better wide receiver prospects that, were playing college football last year that maybe we've seen in a few years, and he more than held his own. He had an interception early on in the game against Ohio State that changed the course of that game. He had an interception the first play of the second half in the national championship game against Washington. That changed the game. That interception, mind you, was also forced in part because of pressure created by Mason Graham. So good team effort there. But, he's a player who, he allowed a 29.1% passer rating last year as a sophomore, according to PFF. That's fifth among cornerbacks in college football. And that's when you're facing, again, your Marvin Harrisons, your Rome Odunze's, some of the best talents in college football. By everything I've heard, he looks fantastic in practice. He looks fantastic in the spring, this summer. I don't think there's any question that he's going to have a very solid year. And if he stays healthy, he's a top 15 pick. No questions asked.
Yeah, and he's going to be one of those guys to watch, because, again, the Bears just drafted Rome Odunze, and so I'm sure there's a lot of, tape out there of Odunze versus seeing Will Johnson. But switching over here to the offensive side of the ball for a bit, you talk about that tight end situation. Okay, I think, everybody, when they look at Big Ten and they specifically look at the Midwest, everyone's always pointing to Iowa and Notre Dame for the good tight ends. But Colston Loveland, to me, is a guy who had a pretty solid freshman season, had a really good sophomore season, and now is entering 2024 with a legit chance to possibly even be the first tight end taken off the board in next year's draft. And that's if he has a massive breakout season. I mean, what's there to know about a guy that is, 6'5", 6'6", just kind of towers over everybody and does a little bit of everything? This is sort of your modern hybrid tight end where he can be on the line of scrimmage as a blocker, but then also flex out into the slot and take over games as a receiver.
Yeah, I think that versatility is the number one thing to know about him. Colston Loveland, you mentioned his physical attributes. He's a kid coming out of tiny town in Idaho called Gooding, Idaho, where he was like the co-player of the year. I want to know where the other guy ended up. But, Colston Loveland, similar type of guy where you could tell his freshman season, he wasn't there yet, but he was going to be, right? It was, he scores his first career touchdown against Ohio State in Columbus. He scores just this acrobatic touchdown, mossing a defender in the Big Ten championship game the next week. And then he's off to the races, right? And he has a very productive sophomore season. He's actually Michigan's leading receiver who's returning this year. Michigan lost its top two actual wide receivers, Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson, to the NFL. So he's like the top receiver returning. And he's the guy that, as Michigan has quarterback uncertainty, as Michigan has, kind of a renewed wide receiver crop, he's the guy who's probably going to be the first option on a lot of routes, on a lot of plays. You mentioned he's 6'5", but he runs and he has hands more like a receiver than a tight end. And at that size and with that skill set, that makes him very, very difficult to guard one-on-one. I'd say he still needs to improve as an inline blocker. He was not Michigan's best blocking tight end last year. Who knows if he'll be Michigan's best blocking tight end this year. He's still obviously an offensive weapon, but you want to see him improve as a blocker and know that if you ever split him out or if he's ever running routes, out of that inline tight end position, if he's one-on-one with a linebacker, that's a mismatch every day. If that's one-on-one with a safety, most safeties, that's a mismatch too. So that presents a lot of opportunity for Michigan's offense. He's a big target for a quarterback who's probably not going to be quite as skilled throwing the ball as J.J. McCarthy was last year. And he'll, presumably bring that to the NFL a year from now.
Yeah, we certainly know Michigan. They're going to want to get off the bus running the ball, right? So improving that blocking, I think, is going to be a key part of his development next year. But switching back over to the defensive side of the ball again, talk to us a little bit about Josiah Stewart, who's kind of an edge rusher prospect who came over from Coastal Carolina last year. Had 5.5 sacks for Michigan on their national championship run, and made some highlight plays throughout the course of the season. So, what does he need to do in order to take that next step forward? And what do you think his draft prospects kind of look like as of now?
Yeah, I think he's on an upward trajectory. And I don't think he was quite ready to go to the NFL after last year. I think he wanted to put more on tape to prove that he could do it at a high level. As you mentioned, Andrew, he came in from Coastal Carolina. He played, he was high school teammates with Mikey Stainer still, who's now in the NFL, obviously a star of the Michigan defense last year, over, I want to say in Everett, Massachusetts. I may be getting that wrong. But the pitch to Josiah Stewart was essentially, listen, you had 2 outstanding years at Coastal. You filled the stat sheet at Coastal. If you can prove that you can do it at the Big Ten level, then that proves that you can do it in the NFL. When you are asking questions of Josiah Stewart, it's really his size. You know, he's pretty undersized as an edge rusher, even at Coastal, and certainly so in the Big Ten. But it works for him. And it was the sort of thing where early in the year last year, you know, he maybe struggled a little bit with the physicality. You could tell that he struggled setting an edge a little bit on running plays. He got edged a few times. But by the end of the year, you know, he was the guy who actually pushes an Alabama offensive lineman back and trips up Jalen Milroe on the last play of the Rose Bowl. Like, he's the guy making those plays. And he's the, you know, by the end of the year, he is not getting edged anymore. He's the guy that, despite his size, you know, he is, you know, low man wins, and he's using that leverage to get back and really disrupt plays. So he and Derek Moore on the other side, like, they're both guys that you've seen take steps forward. Both ended last season on upward trajectories. And while Michigan probably won't have like the feared edge rushers that were like, you know, David Ojabo and Aiden Hutchinson back in 21, it's higher up that level where you can tell that both of those guys have NFL potential, and it's really putting together full seasons to make that happen.
So let me just ask a follow-up, because you talked about Stewart's size. I mean, is there, you know, a chance where you possibly see teams looking at an edge rusher that's 6'1" and saying, okay, maybe we are going to grade him lower than whatever he showed on tape? Because again, when you do watch him, at least for me, I mean, I see a guy that certainly plays bigger than the measurables on a sheet lead onto.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's up for NFL teams to decide, right? It's how do you project this to the next level? How does he fit what you want to do? But I mean, results speak for themselves. And if you can, this is part of why I think he comes back, right? Was he playing at a level by the end of the 23 season, Josiah Stewart, that, you know, he was playing at an NFL caliber level? Like, sure, absolutely. You know, when you're making those sorts of plays, you know, he was a game changer against Alabama. He was a game changer, you know, against Ohio State and Washington in some of Michigan's biggest games of the year. When you're doing that, like, yeah, then you can probably do it in the NFL, but can you show that for a year, right? Because, you know, say what you will about production, but you will always have measurables. You will always have that NFL combine. You will always have guys questioning what you are going to be able to accomplish based on your size and your weight and your frame. So if you can do it for a full season, then you can silence those doubters, right? That's something that Mikey Sainer still at the nickel position. He's a smaller nickel. He proved that last year, and he got drafted. And that's, you know, you need to put together a full body of evidence, maybe to silence some of those doubters. And that's what 15 games in a college football season can do.
I mean, yeah, he's going to be, you know, one of the guys to watch. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, going back to the offensive side of the ball, you know, I talked earlier about how Michigan's going to want to, you know, be a running football team once again next year. That's going to be no surprise. They're getting Donovan Edwards back, but Blake Corum is moving on to the NFL, obviously. So you're losing one of the most productive running backs in college football over the past few years. Is this Edwards' running back room right now? And because we know that, you know, a lot of draft projections, they are pretty high on Edwards and what his potential is. So what is the running back room going to look like for Michigan next year? Yeah,
another one. Really, offensively, every position is a question mark. Maybe outside of who's your, you know, first tight end, who's Colson Loveland. Every other position is a question mark because Michigan, to the NFL Combine last year, sent its entire offensive line +1. So it's top 6 offensive linemen, it's top 2 wide receivers, it's quarterback, it's running back, right? Like that entire offense is being redone. When you're looking at offensive skill position players, though, I mean, Donovan Edwards, again, he was a high 4-star, 5-star type kid from West Bloomfield, Michigan a few years ago. He thought that last year was going to be his year. I mean, if you talk to him, and I did before last season, he was like, okay, 2023, I'm going to ball out. I'm going to be a first-round NFL draft pick in the 2024 NFL draft. It didn't work out for him. Last year, by all measures, including his own, he really struggled. He struggled physically a bit. He struggled with his on-field production, and he struggled mentally with kind of the balancing his own high expectations and maybe the high expectations that other people had for him with the reality that he was a clear number 2 behind Blake Corum. And, he didn't score his first touchdown of the year until more than halfway through the season, if I remember that correctly. So there's a lot of eyes on him this year. And by all measures, he is, he's in a better state mentally. And he also knows that this is his team. It is his running back room. He is running back 1, even if he doesn't want to call himself that. Behind him, there's Khalil Mullings, who's a converted linebacker. There's Benjamin Hall, who's a promising sophomore. But if you're looking for the guy who's going to be your consistent ball carrier, it's going to be Donovan Edwards. And he's a guy like Colston Loveland, where versatility is the reason that he was so high on NFL draft boards maybe a year ago. He's a solid running back. He's got as you saw in the national championship game, he's got that top end speed. If he sees the hole, he can hit it hard. And he's that big play threat. We saw that in 22 against Ohio State. We saw it last year in the national championship game. But can he be a consistent ball carrier? Can he be the guy that picks up 4 yards when only 1 yard's available on a consistent basis? We don't know that quite yet. What we do know, he can hit the home run on the ground. He can split out wide into the slot or even out wide and be a competent wide receiver. And when you combine that with the rest of his skill set, that makes him a dangerous piece.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really good running backs in the Big Ten this year, and I think that we should expect Donovan Edwards to be right there at the very top in terms of production. Again, it's like you mentioned, it's all projections at this point, but how about defensive back Rod Stewart? Because watching him last year, knowing that, he went ahead and had a solid season in my eyes, but then he also injured his knee in spring practices. What's the outlook for him going into this year? Because the first step's obviously him being healthy and him being able to get onto the field, but what does he need to do to really kind of go ahead and show a lot of people that, hey, I am the top safety in the upcoming class?
Yeah, so we're talking about safety Rod Moore here. I don't know, quite honestly, if he's going to play this year, right? It was, Michigan's never going to give you specifics of any injury, but it's an ACL injury of some kind. It's it's a significant knee injury where if he does, he was ahead of schedule earlier this summer, but do you bring him back maybe at, when it's late November and he hasn't played yet? Who knows? That said, he's put 3 solid seasons on tape. He is a player who, I believe the first start or one of his first starts of his collegiate career was November 27th, 2021, a date that Michigan fans remember well, because that's the day they beat Ohio State for the first time in what felt like forever. And that he started that year against, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Garrett Wilson, like that. Olave, I believe, was on that team too, like that fearsome trio from Ohio State. And you've got a freshman Rod Moore starting at safety, and he was fine. And he's kind of parlayed that into, he would have been probably one of the, if not the top safeties in college football had he stayed healthy. It's heartbreaking for him that he wasn't able to do that he got injured very early in spring practice. But he's another one of those guys that Michigan pulled out of Ohio. He didn't have an Ohio State offer. He was a 3-star, if I remember that correctly, and he's absolutely outplayed his recruiting ranking. He's the type of player who ends games, right? He ended the game against Ohio State in 2023 with that game-sealing interception. He is a veteran player with veteran savvy, who maybe didn't have the high school tape or the high school measurables that, the biggest program in his state wanted, Ohio State, but has outplayed any Ohio State safety since then. So, take that for what you will. Obviously, health is number one. I don't think we're going to see much, if anything, to move the needle on him this year because of that injury. But, he's a guy that could have gone last year, and hopefully it works out for him, even though he's been hurt.
Going back to the offensive line, you mentioned how they lost practically their top 6 guys from last year. And that's a huge blow when, Michigan as a program has kind of built their identity around that offensive line and being a more physical team up front than their opposition. So, they brought in some transfers. They've had some guys developing, along that offensive line as well. How is that unit shaping up so far in terms of like who the stars are going to be, and how do you see that unit kind of looking as we get into, I guess you could call it training camp and the start of the season?
Yeah, it offensive lines, as you will know, are so much about both experience, both individually but as a unit. I think people look at Michigan's offensive line and say, listen, this line could be pretty good. There are a number of names there that Michigan has seen, like that we've seen either individually getting spot duty at Michigan or coming from elsewhere. I think 4 positions, like 4 of the 5 on the offensive line, are pretty well set. At center, Michigan has a guy named Greg Crippen, who has been very, very patient. And I know Michigan thinks highly of him. He's been kind of supplanted each of the last 2 years by transfer portal guys. First Olu Oluwatimi, and then Drake Nugent, 2 guys who, Olu Oluwatimi a couple of years ago, I mean, he won the Remington Award. He won the Outland Trophy as the best interior lineman in college football. And then he gets supplanted again last year by Drake Nugent, an NFL level center. But Greg Crippen, Michigan thinks very highly of him at center. He'll be flanked by Gio El-Hadi on one guard spot and Josh Preeb on the other. Gio El-Hadi, again, he's a guy who's a program veteran at Michigan. Michigan staff absolutely loves him. If I had to name a guy who I think will surprise people on Michigan's offensive line, maybe on Michigan's offense, it would probably be Gio El-Hadi. I think he's had some starting, I think he started a game or 2, maybe a couple of years ago, just injury duty. But every single person I've talked to thinks he's about to have a massive year. He'll probably be right guard. And then Josh Preeb, who transferred in from Northwestern, will be on the left side. He's playing his last year of collegiate eligibility, so he'll be, vying for the draft one way or the other. And then at left tackle, you have Miles Hinton. He's one of the Hinton brothers who's come through Michigan. He started at Stanford. He is a massive, massive human. He actually did start the first few games of the year at tackle for Michigan last year before losing his job later in the year. He's a guy who, again, he's massive. He has the frame to be an NFL offensive lineman. It's more about getting the footwork right, getting his balance right, that sort of thing. And, maybe in year 2 in the system, it kind of clicks for him, but we'll see. Like I said, it's an offensive line, and you don't really know what an offensive line is going to look like until you see him live on a college football Saturday. But Michigan certainly, with Sharon Moore, who's an offensive line kind of guru by trade, with Grant Newsome, who's the offensive line coach, who obviously his background is as a lineman at Michigan. I think the coaching's there. I think the players are there, and I think they'll play at a high level again this year.
Yeah, and you mentioned projections earlier. A little bit of a fun fact here, but I was actually doing some research, and as good as Michigan's been, the Bears have only drafted 4 Michigan players dating back to 1987. They've drafted a player from every other Michigan school, but not the University of Michigan for whatever the reason is, but they always love to go to some of the other Big Ten schools. But, you mentioned projections earlier, and JJ McCarthy's now with the Vikings, so we're going to be keeping close eyes on him as guys who cover the Bears. You obviously have a quarterback that you have to name and start here. I mean, I know you had a really good piece that I read yesterday on Alex Orji as to whether or not he could be the guy and all the work that he's done in the Detroit metropolitan area in terms of hosting the youth camp and everything. But who do you ultimately think ends up starting for the Wolverines at quarterback? Because, again, they had J.J. McCarthy, who, again, played his high school football not too far from me. And it was, let me just say this, it was really annoying having to, as a defensive coach, having to coach and game plan against J.J. McCarthy.
Yeah, JJ McCarthy at Nazareth Academy, right? With Tyler Morris, who's a wide receiver still on the team. That's the $1 million question, and it's the question that I think Michigan, sort of by design, doesn't have an answer to, right? I mean, college football these days, if you're a backup quarterback and don't get the job, maybe you're looking at the transfer portal and exploring your options elsewhere, and it's important as a team to have a solid backup quarterback. So with that said, I mean, Michigan is entering fall camp with probably a 4-way battle. It's Alex Orji, it's Davis Warren, who's a very compelling and interesting story. He had cancer in high school, survived cancer, was a walk-on at Michigan, and has now been placed on scholarship and is competing for a starting quarterback job. So it's Alex Orji, Davis Warren, Jack Tuttle, who played at Indiana for a few years. He was injured in the spring, so he didn't get a chance to kind of compete for the job in the spring, but he'll be healthy for the fall. And then Jaden Denegal, who came in the same class as Alex Orji. Those are kind of the 4 who are competing for the job. I'd say based on what we saw in the spring game, what we've seen from him over the last couple of years, it's probably going to be Alex Orji. The reason I say that is because he brings something to the table that he does at an elite level, right? He is an elite runner of the football. He is, there's a reason Michigan has used him the last couple of years and, your wildcat type packages, because you put the ball in his hands, he's tough to bring down. Is he going to be a competent level quarterback? Like that's the question. His junior and senior years of high school, his completion percentage as a starting quarterback hovered around 50%. That doesn't project well to the college level. He hasn't thrown, I don't believe he has 1 completion in real live college football action. So it's a big ask to say, okay, you're going from never throwing the ball and maybe not throwing the ball as well as you'd want to in high school to now you're the starting quarterback at Michigan. But he is so elite as a runner that he brings something to the table that maybe Michigan can ride with, some up and down passing. Otherwise, probably Davis Warren. Again, that would be a great story. He's kind of like a JJ light in the sense that he's got, very good arm strength. He knows that the offense well. He can run with the ball if he needs to. But he's not JJ McCarthy. But I'd say it's probably between those 2.
Yeah, quarterback, it's going to be the position that I think is going to really determine Michigan's season next year. And then speaking of the season, last question for you, Alejandro, before we get you out of here. Obviously Ohio State is going to be the big game every single year for Michigan. But when you look at the schedule next year, what's the most intriguing matchup for you for Michigan this year and something that really sticks out for you?
It's going to be a fun season. I don't know how much you or your listeners have followed Michigan football over the last couple of years, but really it's been like 2 game seasons for Michigan just because, their non-conference scheduling worked out a certain way and the Big Ten worked out a certain way where it's like, it was the Ohio State game, it was the Penn State game, and kind of that was it during the regular season. I mean, this year Michigan hosts Texas. They opened their season against a solid Fresno State team. They play Oregon. They go on the road to Washington. They're on the road at Ohio State. Obviously, you've got the in-state rivalry with Michigan State. Like there is a lot of very, very good football that Michigan's going to play this year. And if I'm thinking about what Michigan's record might be, it's maybe there's a step back in top level talent, or at least in experienced talent, but it's also the schedule, right? You can't, you don't have your 2-game season where you can kind of prepare just for a game or two like you did the last couple of years. So week 2 is Texas, and I think for me that's that's kind of like that's the tone setter for the season, because you have 2 college football playoff teams playing at the Big House. It's going to be one of the biggest non-conference games of the year, and if you can beat Texas, then that gives you a little bit more leeway, a little bit more kind of rope over the remaining 10 games of the year, where you don't have to be perfect to make a 12-team college football playoff, right? And you have the schedule where you can drop that game to Oregon. You can maybe lose to Ohio State and still make the college football playoff. That wasn't necessarily the case each of the last couple of years. So if you can kind of bank a win against Texas, where it's at home, where you're going to have a rocking crowd, you're going to have potentially the best defense in college football. If you can scrape out a win, if you can get that offense competent enough to score, maybe 20 points, will do it for you. That sets the tone for the season. It just completely changes the outlook for what the year could look like, and it puts you ahead of the 8 ball. And for me, that's the game I have circled. You're always going to circle Ohio State. Oregon and Ohio State, I believe, are probably the top 2 contenders in the Big Ten this year. Michigan plays both of them. Going on the road to Washington, I personally can't wait. I'm going to try to sailgate. I'm going to try to, just experience Big Ten life in Seattle as best I can. But that Texas game is going to be a prime time Big Ten SEC matchup like we all imagined.
I mean, yeah, and we had, Ohio State and Oregon guys on the podcast last week, kind of talking to them about their respective programs and what to expect. And, the Ohio State guy said something. He's just like, yeah, we haven't beaten Michigan in 3 to 4 years at this point. So hopefully that's something that changes, because they did lose, referring to the Wolverines, a lot of talent. And then, Oregon with Dan Lanning and everything that they've kind of built over there, they're a relatively young team, young coaching staff on the rise, really good defense. So it's going to be some really good tests for Michigan. But, before we get you out of here, where can people kind of follow you in the world of social media and keep up with your work, especially for our 247 sports listeners that kind of tune into the boards and love to have a discussion as well?
Yeah, I mean, of course, all of my work, you can find it over at 24/7. It's michigan.247sports.com. If you want to follow me specifically for whatever reason, I'm on Twitter at @Zuniga, and often talking online on shows like this.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for hopping on. We'll have to have you on again at some point, during the season, to just get an update on all things Michigan.
Sounds good. Appreciate it, guys.